Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Happy to be joined by my friend and colleague Josh Blank, Research Director of the Texas Politics Project. Welcome to High Summer.
Oh, yeah. It's definitely high summer because my kids are in my office while we're recording this.
Yes, the very definition of high summer. Eating candy.
Eating candy and making
gifted by my wife,
making
of course.
messes.
I don't want to. You'd have to carry that burden as a parent.
No, exactly.
So, we've been away for a bit. Our last podcast that we released was kind of the simulcast that we did with Pat on the last poll. And to say the least, a lot has happened since then. There's no way to cover it all today. We're going to focus on the special session agenda,
right.
The politics around that. Obviously, all kinds of other things going on. The July 4th floods could be a topic in and of themselves that will get discussed in the context of the special session. We've had some personal news from Senator and Attorney General Paxton, which, while interesting in a panel I was on yesterday, there was kind of a consensus that it really wasn't going to affect the Attorney General very much.
Yeah.
At least among my other panelists. I'm not sure I'm entirely convinced.
I was just thinking about a bunch of old people going, well, yeah, marriage is tough.
Yeah, well, except that it wasn't a bunch of old guys.
No.
I mean, it was actually a younger version of that
true.
panel.
There was
we had James Buttigan.
That's right. There's one younger.
The guy's been in the business a while. He's a vet. He's a pro. But, compared to me, he's like 12.
That's right. Exactly.
So, a lot of things going on. But let's start. So we'll start with the obvious. As everybody here knows, Governor Abbott announced the special session of the Texas Legislature that will meet on the 21st. He announced the specific agenda, and we'll get into this timing is kind of interesting. He telegraphed that there was going to be a special session, and then came out with the initial agenda right at the end of the signing session when he very controversially, and we talked about this last week somewhat in the Pat simulcast, when he vetoed the legislation strongly and very vocally favored by Dan Patrick on THC products. But that initial agenda has been, it's been one of the things that's commented on, and then we're going to deconstruct it some, is that it's another big one. Right. It's a long agenda, which is kind of I think in retrospect, we'll probably look at this and see it as a common Greg Abbott play.
It's a good use of the tools at his disposal, I think, turns out.
Now, in the interim, we've seen this terrible flooding in the Hill Country on July 4th. I've got it in my kind of shorthand notes to myself, altered the terrain of the special session, made an already complex session more complicated.
Right.
But I think a lot of what we were sorting out as we've talked about it since then and talking about before we came on air is, exactly how that complicates things. There's no lack of things to point to, but settling on what that dynamic actually means, I think, is going to be a matter of some discussion today.
No, it's funny. I mean, as we sit here and as you bring it up again, we were talking about this just a little bit ago, sort of in the lead up to this, and sort of thinking about the way that it complicates it. And then, and look, this is a podcast about politics.
Yeah.
So just to sort of set that out, setting aside the particulars of the tragedies and everything that went on out there. And I've been out to Kerrville, like we've all been around, and I think a lot of people don't appreciate that. Texas is big. It's not that big kind of thing,
Yeah.
But nonetheless, when just looking at the politics, it's sort of a first thing, well, this complicates. And then you think, or does it? Because it sort of seems like, as we've kind of been talking about, it seems like it's actually probably going to provide, say the leadership with a little bit more cover on some of this other stuff that might be a little bit more, I don't know, touchy.
Well, I just think it's going to, we'll get to it. It's going to scramble priorities in a way that I don't, I think how that unfolds is a little unclear. And part of that is because, the coverage and the discussion is still kind of going on.
Yeah.
And this is going to re-raise all that. There are going to be field hearings of the select committee that's been put together in both houses.
Yeah. And I mean,
there's going to be a hearing in Austin fairly soon, I think middle of next week, and then there's going to be a field hearing in Kerrville. So.
Yeah, and I mean, I think what it comes down to is, I think it's sort of a weird thing, but the legislature is keyed to respond to this. I mean, there have been bills that have been filed in the past. If you read the coverage of this, that would have done some things that might have helped in this sort of scenario. They can go back to that kind of stuff. So it's not like they're sort of there's no they're starting from scratch on any of this stuff. They have ideas.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you approach it, from the sterile, view of like a policy problem.
Yeah.
They're not getting at this from scratch, and we'll get into this, but the politics hovering over this, when you've got both President Trump and Governor Abbott calling people losers for trying to say, hey, was there any responsibility here? Or, should we probe what might have gone wrong?
Well,
and
I mean, we're not gonna...
there's not going to be a whole lot of desire to do that.
Yeah, and we're not, and I mean, there's not even a lot of desire to do that here at this moment right now. But I just want to hone in on one thing for a second about it, which I think is why there's a certain amount of flexibility. And we've talked about this, is that for people looking to say, well, it was this or it was that. I mean, as someone who's here, it's sort of hard to say if you really want to point at something, people are trying to do this. There's sort of just an overall cultural element to it. And when I say cultural, that's a big word, but just in the sense of I was up in Kerrville recently, actually, this past semester.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, one of the things, when we were doing is the Hill Country Economic Summit, and somebody came up from the city and they were sort of talking about Kerrville, and they're saying, you can go on our website and you can look at every line in the budget. And if you want to submit your own budget, that, you can go and make all these adjustments. And I just tell that to say, it really, when people say hey, this is a fiscally conservative place, hey, the idea, they bristled at the cost of this stuff. It's that is very real.
Yeah.
And there's no and so that's just to say that there's no if only, everybody had just done this one thing, then everything. It's it doesn't work that way. But to me, what that means is that there's also a lot of flexibility in terms of what the response is going to look like, given what are the constraints that existed. Because honestly, you can do just about anything that might make people feel better about the future with this.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. But I also think that there's an interesting dynamic here. And we saw this a little bit, but in a less diffuse way, after Winter Storm Uri and the blackouts and deaths that came after that. And I think what we're seeing with the flooding and the issue of response and, who asked for money when, who said no, who decided it was too much, and there's been a lot of coverage and a lot of unpacking of that. There was a fairly decent New York Times podcast, one of the reporters on the ground that was talking about this and had talked to a lot of the local officials and had kind of done some pretty good spade work on this and was, I think, trying to be fair. Yeah. And there was kind of a sense of, there were a lot of people that made decisions at times that you could say contributed.
Yeah.
May not have prevented this, but probably prevented the implementation of things that might have made it a little less severe, might have saved some lives. But you're in a position where when it's diffuse like that, and it's diffuse among all three, involving, all three levels of the federal structure. Right. There's some national money that was floating around here and, who was making decisions about that. There's the parallel issue of the Weather Service and DOGE and the cuts and all that. And then there's this money that was going from the federal government through the state that they were administering to the localities and who was making decisions about that and who got more, all of this. And the conclusion there, the line that came out is, the problem is, when, there's kind of no easy person to blame and there's a lot of actors involved, then no one's responsible.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the dynamic I'm kind of feeling right now with this, the turn in the tone of politics where, Greg Abbott feels free to call, a reporter a loser for asking a question about
this is pretty wild
what might happen, right? And so
it's pretty wild but sensible. I mean, it's both wild and it totally fits the context you laid out there, but also the current political dynamic right now that we're in.
That's exactly right. And so I think that's why it's, I feel like there's a part of me that wants to go, this will just go into the process and they'll just kind of address it with a similar diffuse approach that we've seen them address a lot of these problems, do some things in the short run that demonstrate action, do some things that are geared more towards the middle and longer run. Studies will be held, spend some money. And I guess, now we're just talking about it. So, but, we were talking when we started, though, that, before we came on air, what is the, we're seeing different proximate comparisons. I've already implicitly made the proximate comparison with the storm, with Winter Storm Uri. The other is gun violence, and in particular, the Uvalde shootings, which really mobilized the legislature. But in both of those cases, our polling showed that though one might argue that more or less good faith efforts were made, I would an asterisk on the gun stuff for the Uvalde shootings.
Yeah, it's a little tricky given what happened.
And that had a, but more or less, you could say, look, action was taken, a response was made.
Yeah.
The legislature did stuff, and the public has been kind of meh about it. I mean, the overall pattern, particularly on grid reliability, which affected the most people of all three of these examples, has been, I'm not that confident that what they did is going to really address the situation.
Well, same thing with school safety. I mean, honestly, whenever we ask questions about sort of legislative priorities around education, school safety still tops the list. When we ask specifically, do you think the legislature has done something to reduce the chances of school violence? Again, the fences are out. If you go by schools, you can see the new fences, but people said no. I mean, there was not a lot of confidence there either. And so, I mean,
and my only point about that is not that anybody's responsible or they're going to do it or they're not going to do it, but is that it's difficult to kind of figure out when you drop these issues into this agenda that's already existing that we're going to talk about in a second, like, how does all of that interact, particularly with the politics of redistricting?
And how much should we expect it to?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the piece I would just throw out there is I think, when you layer all that stuff in, I think there's an ongoing discussion that we've had in this podcast for a while. And it's a question, I think, that's sort of floating around out there, which is, is there a point at which complete Republican control of statewide leadership and all houses of government and everything accrues some kind of responsibility to at least the accumulation of these things that can be seen as, if you just want to pile it into like one big bucket, ineffective governance, whether that's the inability to protect kids in the schools. I'll say this way, you could do this real quick and say, if you're a Democrat right now and you want to run an ad, you could say, I wish Texas were a place where when it rained and snowed, people didn't die.
Yeah.
And that kind of just sums up the idea here that there's just a little bit too much of this going on. And you kind of go back even to Hurricane Harvey and think about sort of how and when the city was or was not evacuated and things like that. And so these things are sitting there. But the problem is that for most, the problem for Democrats here is that for most people, if you believe the government's being mismanaged, you're probably not voting for Republicans anyway.
Yeah.
And honestly, there's going to be a very small share of people who otherwise are really happy with what's going on, but don't really think that on some of these kind of core fundamental stuff that they're doing a great job. But at the same time, if they're happy with what's going on in an ideological sense otherwise, which is kind of what we're pointing to with its other stuff, are you really going to go around and vote for Democrats if you get redistricting, if you get property tax cuts?
And so you may tell, when you're asked on a poll,
right?
You have faith that they've done a good job. You're going to say no, but that's not going to.
That's not the operative consideration
right?
Here.
It's the follow up on that is not.
Yeah, right.
And so
now right.
I'm voting for.
Well, and I think it goes back to the fact that a lot of the
whatever Democrat,
right, and so that there is going to be some movement in some places, and we've already kind of talked about it a little bit on this podcast, and we might see some more of that. But for most Republican voters, who are a majority of the voters in the state, there's lots that they can look to from this session and say that's a good job. And we talked about this. There's a lot of things that they can hang their hats on in terms of the voucher bill, in terms of property tax reduction, in terms of increasing funding to public education, putting money into water, all that stuff. Before you even get to this, and this is like a different kind of list.
Except
now.
that, and yet now, if the history of the 89th legislature had already been written without it, and it had all been written in the regular session, it would look a lot. I think it's. That's different than now having to write with all this here. And I take your point that, we were going to talk about attention to the legislature and all this. But, I still kind of feel like this is not anything that most anybody really wanted.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. One of the things that's really shocking sitting here right now with a special session coming up next week is the fact that, I don't know, I'm not good with time, but let's say 4 to 8 weeks ago, I don't think you could find a person who thought that anybody wanted to have a special session.
Right. Well, the few people that said, well, I'm hearing, and
Yeah,
now
to be fair.
there were a few people
Yeah.
that were saying, well, I'm hearing rumors that they want to do redistricting,
Right.
that their kids coming from DC. And we kind of went, oh,
Okay.
But, it turned out that is a priority of Donald Trump and the people around him, and it's been pressed. So let's step back. So what do we have? So we have the special session proclamation in which,
Right.
we now have, the flood mitigation. So what is, just stepping in very general terms, is we're going to want to talk about the politics of the agenda, because we're going to have to talk about agenda management.
Right. Yeah.
In the session. So what do we have? We have 4 items that are related to flood disaster relief and funding and evaluating preparedness. So, a bucket of flooding and disaster items. You've got, bringing back legislation to eliminate the STAR test, which didn't make it last session, was discussed but didn't get through.
Yeah.
You've got a kind of general invitation to reduce property tax burden on Texans, but also more specifically to impose spending limits on entities authorized to impose property taxes. Now that's in line with his emergency item, to be fair. No, that's still, that's
it's a little bit, well.
That's
anyway.
something that, when you're putting an agenda together, you're Greg Abbott and you're thinking about what you want, what you've asked for already, what they haven't delivered, and the fact that you're running next year, having property taxes on the call. You've already done a pretty big property tax relief bill, but,
Well, and just to hop on the polling for 1 second here, and when we ask people what they expect about their property taxes in the June poll after they pass the most recent reduction, it's still the case that more people expect their property taxes to go up in the future than expect them to go down. And in fact, the share who expects them to go up is higher than at the end of the last session when we asked the question again. So,
which kind of folds back onto the discussion we were having a few minutes ago about, just the general sense of low expectations and low levels of faith in the political class.
Yeah.
And, unfortunately for them, that includes the Texas Legislature.
Right.
Okay, so then 2 items on hemp, which everybody listening to this issue that came up as, adopted by the lieutenant governor as a big issue. He really wants to abolish access to these products writ large. Rammed a bill through on this, I think a little bit surprisingly, through the House side to a lot of people. And then the governor vetoed it.
Yeah.
After a lot of consideration. It was kind of for all intents and purposes, and based on what we know, it was the thing that he was hanging on to and that led to, the late night vetoes on the day 20 of the veto period, the last day. So we got those out there, big things, and obviously we'll come back to that. A very general invitation to legislate on abortion.
Yep.
Language of the language of the proclamation worth looking at. Legislation further protecting unborn children and their mothers from the harm of abortion. Now, just to be as concrete as possible about that, you compare the generality of that, the broad scope of that, to the one above it on hemp, legislation to comprehensively regulate hemp-derived products, including limiting potency, restricting synthetically modified compounds, and establishing enforcement mechanisms, all without banning a lawful agricultural commodity. So, 2 very different approaches to these 2 problems. You've got the evergreen among, conservative social media-enabled Republicans on quote-unquote taxpayer-funded lobbying. Then you've got 4 items that are revisiting issues that he vetoed, and I'm not going to go into the specifics of those, but that's bringing back things, and the veto messages on these items had pretty specific guidance. Then you've got an item on proposing a constitutional amendment that would allow the Attorney General, still in the news very much, to prosecute state election crimes. So speaking to election dynamics, quote unquote voter fraud, also a favorite with Republican primary audience. And then, kind of 9th or something on this list.
Tucked in, you could say.
I honestly have to admit, and people that, on my social media account, I'm on the record, I kind of missed it in the first pass because it was so buried. I thought, he's going to add it later. I had to go back and delete the tweet and redo it.
Yeah, it was fun for me because I don't get those very often. Right? You go, it's in there.
Right.
So
congressional redistricting. So that's where we are for now. And so, I think what this does is introduce, given this menu,
Yeah.
and given the context, what does the agenda look like? And I think, there are a lot of factors to take into consideration here. Right?
Yeah.
There's we've talked a lot about, flood and disaster response. And, I think we've kind of set some of the politics of that out there.
Yeah.
And the fact that, there are questions about public attention to that and how long that will last, what it looks like in the context of a legislature that people don't have a lot of faith in anyway and don't pay a lot of attention to anyway. But we'll come back to that because I don't want to assume facts that are not yet in evidence. But on redistricting, redistricting really structurally changes or has a big structural effect on how this is going to unfold because already, and it's cooled off a little today, but, I think you probably did one or two. I did a couple of media hits yesterday on, and or answered. Actually, some of it was just answering questions from political friends from out of state, going, okay, so what about this redistricting thing? Are the Democrats going to break quorum?
Right.
How serious is this? Can they? And I think, the quorum break reflex here, which is put in the context by a lot of people of, well, Democratic voters are pissed off that Democrats aren't doing enough to push back against, Republican perfidy and all this kind of stuff. But, the drama of the quorum break, which we've seen fairly recently, 2021, and then, the historic back in the 2000s, those have generally not turned out very well for the Democrats.
Well, and you started this by saying, okay, so like here's this agenda now, what do we think about it? I think these things relate, which is when I look at this whole agenda, and I think you could quibble here, but when I say, what do they have to do?
Yeah.
What do they have to come
So
with?
we started this offline too, and I started the panel with this yesterday, so I'm curious, what do you think?
Yeah, I think they have to respond to the flood because that's just basic politics. It's happened, it's on people's minds. They've said they're going to
have to, meaning we mean if they don't do it, the governor will call them back.
Yeah. And and the things, and I also just think I even say, and I even mean it in a more colloquial sense, which is like, they're going to do it because they're going to have the votes from both Democrats and Republicans to get something done here.
Yeah.
And there's a desire to act. The other thing I think they have to get done because of the politics of this is redistricting. And I don't have a much longer list than that, to be quite honest. I don't even think, like the hemp thing, I think if they get something done that meets the governor's, very specific instructions, I think he'd be happy to sign it. If they can't do it in the time window with everything else going on and we just keep the status quo until the next session, I kind of think he'd be fine with that too.
Yeah.
And so,
well, that raises the question then of,
right,
would the lieutenant governor let that happen?
Well, I think
if it's in his power.
So let me ask a question to you. Let me turn it back to you in this way, because the way that we were talking about this before, and you had set this up, is that because of the flooding, the idea of a Democratic quorum break, setting aside even if the flooding didn't happen, but now given the flooding, it really changes the calculus for Democrats because, I'm just going to say this because of the way that they're going to end up sequencing this stuff, right?
Yeah.
It's very unlikely. Let's put it this way: there is a 0% chance that they come in and they say, let's deal with all this flood mitigation stuff right now. And then we'll deal with all this really hot political stuff after we've dealt with this. Because then, the Democrats could do this and leave. That's not going to happen, be political malpractice. In fact, we've seen various instances of this kind of dynamic play out. People are very aware of the sequencing. Yeah, no, and certainly in the building. Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah. When I talk about people, not normal people. But. This is one of the things that's very interesting, right? Is, and I can't remember, I think can't remember if this came up in the panel yesterday and me talking to people about it afterwards, is that, this all puts I think Gromer Jeffers brought this up yesterday. This Dustin Burrows in a very interesting position. It does. He's come out of that session, one of the big storylines at the end of the regular session was, hey, Dustin Burrows, look at it. He managed to do this. And on the panel yesterday, one of my panelists, who I won't name, Harvey Crumpler, kind of talking about the degree to which, the rap on Burrows, and to be fair to Harvey, he didn't articulate this as his position, but that the rap on Burrows among a lot of people per Harvey is that, the way he accomplished that was by just doing what the lieutenant governor wanted. I'll have to think. I mean, I think that like just
that's fair.
on its
I say
face,
so that's fair enough.
It sounds fair enough. And yeah, that's right. That is fair enough. So anyway, the point being, though, just to go back, it's like, okay, so the Democrats probably aren't in a position, given the introduction of the flood relief and response, to just disappear because they're going to be raked over the coals for it.
Yeah, no, that, it would be political malpractice for the Republicans to move that first and give them the opportunity to do that. But I do kind of think it would be political malpractice for the Democrats to follow up on your scenario to say, everybody understands that redistricting is a fundamental issue of fairness to our base, to justice, to democracy, and we got to go.
No. And that's crazy because most people have like no idea what redistricting is. So we start there, but then the flip side is the question that you were kind of pushing into, which I'll push back to you, which is like, okay, so if the Democrats are constrained now in this way, and this, you brought up Burroughs too, which I think is an interesting thing just to think about how he enters into this. What are Patrick's, what are sort of the red lines for Patrick on this with respect to THC and hemp, given this sequencing, given this constellation of issues, given the pressure of the president to get something done on redistricting, the floods. I mean, all of a sudden it just feels like the hemp thing, which like everybody was so focused on until redistricting came along, it just doesn't feel like it.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, look, that hemp bill, I mean, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what the Senate comes up with for the hemp bill.
Yeah, I mean,
given the call.
Right. And that's right. I mean, I guess they can't just do what they did.
Right.
So
yeah, I mean,
they can't just pass the same bill, which is kind of,
I don't think so.
Which is that is Patrick's normal kind of MO would be just pass the same bill and say, we passed this bill. It's good. You pass it and let's go.
And either the House, it's the House's fault that nothing got sent to the governor, or the House goes along and sends it to the governor, and then he vetoes it again and says that violates the call. What's wrong with you guys?
And
but I believe actually it wouldn't. Actually, I'm not stopping to think carefully enough. That can't happen because what will happen is if they send that bill to the House and it was to make it to the floor, it will just get called a
point of order.
There'll be a point of order on it. It's not consistent with the call. So,
right. So yeah, I mean, I think that's
I'm gonna cool my jets on racing through these scenarios.
But I guess the point being, I mean, I just don't know. I mean, just to the same extent that like Democrats can't just do whatever they want because of the insertion of this natural disaster and the horrible consequences of it. I think Patrick is also probably likely a little bit more constrained than he would have been for the same reasons, right? I mean, he's got the same considerations on his mind.
I mean, it's one thing to hold, whatever, the budget or a property tax bill or, to hold, X bill hostage because you want to get vouchers. Yeah. Right. Whole other thing to say, look, we got to ban marijuana and we're not moving anything until we do that.
Yeah.
Or ban THC hemp products. We're not moving anything. People go, so you're not willing to move flood relief.
Right.
And disaster relief.
But also.
And you're going to tell the big daddy in Washington, D.C., that his redistricting is going to have to wait.
Yeah.
Because, you've got a bone to pick with Governor Abbott about THC products. I just think the politics of that are not great.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, the train has left the station. And I said this to you before, but like, I mean, there's a lot about this call that reminds me a lot of 2017, right? And like now it's like I kind of go, oh, that was like a little while ago. Been here long enough that it's like, oh, it's been a bit.
Yeah.
But right, Patrick goes, he's not happy because the House spiked the bathroom bill at that point in time.
Right.
Then he spikes some regulations, some sunset bills. We've got
it's the high point of conflict between Patrick and Strauss,
right? And then all of a sudden,
and the dysfunction between Strauss, Patrick, and Abbott.
Yeah, and jokingly, it's like that's when everybody was a plumber for a minute, right? But also like the American Medical, or the Medical Association.
I just want to say I wasn't a plumber.
No, you were. Everybody was a plumber, but then there was also like doctors, and there's other things that were really important. So he forced a special session. And the thought was, and we had this discussion at the time. I mean, everybody was kind of like, well, what's Abbott going to do? Is he going to just call back like just the sunset bills? Is he going to do the bathroom bill because the businesses were against the bathroom bill? And Abbott did none of that. He came back with a 20-item special session list that had almost every political issue that could matter to a Republican primary voter. They got through, I believe, a little more than half, I think, when all was. I think it was like 12 of the 20 is like the number in my mind, but someone can check. And then I remember after that, Patrick, Abbott came out and said, and Patrick came out after that and said, the House really messed this up. And Abbott came out and said, look at all that I did.
Yeah.
I was able to get these 12 additional things passed. And, on these other things, well, sometimes the legislature is capable of doing it and, sometimes they're not. Yeah. But I'm not calling them back. Small government state. We've got what we want. Let's move on. And I look at this list and I feel, there's been a lot of discussion going on about how, thinking about Abbott's last run for governor and sort of the unpleasantness of having to run against, multiple kind of well-funded people and sort of the implications of that.
Oh, in the primary.
In the primary. And so the idea is, a lot of people were sort of pointing out this time, like he really doesn't want to have a bunch of primary challengers this time. And boy, does it seem unlikely that's going to happen. And part of that is, you've got $80 million in the bank, but also whether or not they do 90% of this and setting aside the things that we think they need to do, redistricting and water and the flood stuff, it's like, yeah, I tried to get them to eliminate the STAR test. I couldn't do it. I tried. You know what?
I gave them an invitation to send me a ban on mifepristone, and they didn't get their act
I tried to get them to decrease your property taxes even more because I think you're being burdened, but they couldn't do it. And so he's in the catbird seat at this point,
right?
No matter what. And so it really,
to the extent that if he even gets called on the carpet for that, right?
Yeah, which again, that's the point. It doesn't even matter. That's the point. It's the insulation of it. And he's never going to be called to the carpet on it. So that's exactly the point of doing it.
Yeah. But
it does sort of, it sort of speaks.
Though I will still go back and say, but all things being equal.
Yeah.
And this is what I thought you were going to raise. The hypothetical I was posing when we were in the office before coming up.
Yeah, this is
here to record was, imagine a universe, if you can, where Trump is not pressuring them on redistricting, but everything else is the same.
Yeah.
Now, that's problematic, as I was saying, because, Abbott's veto decisions may or may not. I would be surprised if they were not at least because he's a pro, took into account the fact that they knew the pressure was coming, was already being exerted for the redistricting session. But just for sake of argument, say there's no redistricting on the agenda and they're not under pressure to call a session for that. Does he call a special session for the pot bill after the lieutenant governor pitched a fit about it? Or then, a week later, or a couple weeks later, does he then call a special session for flood relief and emergency relief? And and it's hard for me to not imagine that what he would have done was said, yeah, I vetoed that bill, but I'm going to have HHS put together we're going to investigate and increase enforcement on these THC dealers. Lieutenant Governor was right. This is being run loosely, but we don't have to oversteer because they're businesses. Just a modification of the position he's taken.
Yeah.
And on the flood mitigation, he declares an emergency and he finds ways to dip into the pots of money and the resources they already have to deal with it. And he's the guy that's dealing with it.
Yeah.
And what's the legislature going to do?
Hold interim hearings.
Yeah.
Which just to say real quick,
why not?
Not even a terrible response, really. Yeah. But I think to your point.
So, and I don't, look, I'm not even sure now what the point of that exercise is.
Can I pick it up?
But I think the point is that it does.
No, I want to pick it up because you asked me before about this, and the question was basically, and I was having a hard time because there are a lot of counterfactual elements to this, and there's a lot of things you have to hold constant. But the idea is, okay,
you're a nonfiction guy.
I'm very much a nonfiction guy. It's true. But the question becomes, absent the push for redistricting, do we see a special session, even with the flooding, even with the THC veto? And at first I was like, well, yeah. And then in the 25 minutes, 30 minutes since we had that conversation, I'm like, I don't think so.
Yeah.
And it's more of a gut feeling because obviously there's so much pieces to this. But you think about, again, the disasters we've had in the past. The thing about the winter storm was we were in session. So it wasn't like, they had to call them in for a special.
Yeah, right. They didn't have a choice.
Uvalde, they did not call them in. And also, just to make a point, after Uvalde, the thing they did in the first session after that, I believe, was pass constitutional carry. So, what the nature of the response looks like is its own thing. But I think to your point, absent the call for a redistricting, which requires the special session and requires it now because of the nature of the calendar, I don't know if they're here right now.
Yeah.
You're right.
Look, I think the one argument.
Can I just?
Go ahead.
And part of it is what I said before. The fact, I don't think this. I'm looking at the proclamation.
Yeah.
But I obviously don't think the goal is to pass something for all these because it's almost impossible if you watch the legislature to think that they're really going to get through all this stuff. But some of it's clearly just not happening. Like legislation proposing a constitutional amendment allowing the attorney general to prosecute state election crimes. How many Democratic votes do you think you get on that? How about none? That is not a real item.
Yeah. That's not going to happen.
But that's the thing, though. But it's on there because you get to say you did it.
Look, I would say that even more so about the abortion item.
Sure.
You look at our numbers on abortion.
Right.
And we're a broken record on the podcast about just how divided Republican public opinion is on that. do you really want to open this up? I mean, maybe it's okay-ish for a Republican primary, but do you want to go into the general election with that being something you just did? Now, look, they could go and do it, and, he'd have to sign it.
Yeah.
So, but I think you're right. I mean, I think not only are there things that he doesn't necessarily expect that they'll do anything, he just wants the credit for raising them. I think there's some things on here he actively doesn't want them to do.
Right. But he can say, hey, I tried.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, which is, part of being, politically skilled.
Yeah, and I think that's the overall point here. I mean, for me, it's like, you've watched Abbott over time do this stuff, and it's like, okay, he's taking control of this process now. He's taking it from Patrick. And by the way, in this little interim period, while he's kind of been thinking about it, he's raised $20 million because that's also like what you do.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of people who have a lot of things they'd like to put on a special session agenda. And so if you say, I'm probably going to make a special session agenda, it's really a pretty open invitation for people to make their pitches.
Yeah.
And so, you said, I think you see that in the numbers, and that's just another indication of, again, I think how good he is at using the office.
Now, I would add two things to that to get us close to the end here. First, back on the agenda thing for a beat, I want to give the idea that the THC hemp thing could kind of reemerge a fair enough shot. Yeah. And that's also and I want to do that in part by pointing out that, look, there is, we've been, I've been a little dismissive, I think, in referring to the way the lieutenant governor has gone after this, and I'm okay with that. But to be fair, there is some political exposure here for Abbott if they do nothing. I don't think it's a lot.
Yeah.
But, the lieutenant governor has established this as an issue from his perspective that is about protecting kids, public health, et cetera. So there's a little bit of exposure to just saying, hey, this will be fine till next time. And look, the governor's very careful.
Yeah.
Part of what you're just describing is his caution and his strategic thinking and his ability to foresee hazards and go out of his way to avoid them or
very lawyerly.
address the exposure, address the risk, and get in front of it.
Yeah.
And so, it's possible the THC thing, might have driven a little bit more. And I also want to say it's also possible then that, again, depending on how these things unfold, what kind of opportunities on, the lieutenant governor's part, no political slouch himself, what he sees as an opening to both get what he wants on this and put pressure on the governor.
Yeah, I mean,
and the speaker for that.
No,
matter.
and I think that's fair. And I think there's I have two. I agree, and I'll sort of push back. My agreement would be to say, the thing about Patrick is, say what you want about him, like him, hate him, whatever. I think he's committed to some of the things he's committed to. I mean, he's demonstrated that. He's demonstrated that with vouchers.
And this is one of the things he seems committed to.
Look, and for people like us who've been around for a long time, right? Ish. I mean, not Harvey long time, but in the sense that we've heard things multiple times, it's we know that Patrick has been pushing for vouchers for a very, very long time. He is ideologically committed to vouchers. And what we saw was he would take any voucher bill. He put something in the House, they put it back. He said, great. We've heard for a long time that Patrick does not like the general expansion of THC access at all.
Right.
This is something
hemp or otherwise.
Yeah, hemp or otherwise. And this is something that he's been committed to. I mean, I think I've heard statements, you've heard statements where he says, yeah, I know what the public opinion is. I don't care. He's even said it really in the public now that he doesn't really care what the public opinion is. He feels that he's right on this issue. So I think that is we just have to acknowledge that that's there. We don't want to just dismiss that. At the same time, I guess what I would say to push back on is okay, but is the lieutenant, if the thing just the status quo remains, this bill doesn't get passed, we move on, what is the likelihood that the lieutenant governor continues on with the rhetoric that clearly the governor wants to create legal marijuana in the state? Is he really going to keep pushing this through the Republican? I don't think so.
I don't either.
And so I think that, the credibility of the threat here is pretty limited. And so I think, I think everybody probably knows that.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably, I suspect that, the governor's people will have factored that and probably polled in detail on it, I suspect. But that's why I think the bigger caution that I would think he might consider, and I don't, again, part of it is just in this counterfactual scenario, so I've already spent too much time on it than I should have probably. But the other thing is that there's another risk separate from just the political risk of Dan Patrick trash talking him
Yeah.
and encouraging opposition that, if something happens,
Yeah.
a bad batch of gummies
Yeah.
kills some people, or
Some kid walks
some
into
kids,
traffic,
some kids wind up getting into some gummies. They, whatever. There's a bad
Right.
run or whatever that it might be. I think they're probably more worried about that. I mean, I'm not saying they're ignoring, because they never ignore the lieutenant governor, but. So anyway, so there's that. All right. So let's the one other thing I was gonna raise, and this is just one last bit of speculation, is that though I haven't had the chance to talk to somebody and ask them, okay, well, game that out for me, why you think this. But I think there's a kind of a general sense, or shouldn't say general, there's a very common sense out there that they're not, whatever they do, whatever comes out of this or doesn't come out of this, it's not going to be just one session. I feel a lot of people going, there's no way they're going to grapple with all this in one session. Now, whether that's 60 days or 30 and another 4 or 5, but that also is kind of into this whole, it gets us back to how the Democrats game this out. Because look, this came up in the panel yesterday, but I think it's pretty obvious that goes back to why agenda management is so and sequencing in particular is so important here. Because if whatever happens, if Patrick and Burrow somehow can't agree on how they're going to do this, or the governor somehow disrupts this, or the Democrats come up with a way short of breaking quorum to chub and to delay and, to slow things down, which they did do reasonably effectively. I mean, within the universe of possibility in the last session. And redistricting doesn't get to the floor till closer to the end. Well, the price, literal and political, that Democrats pay for breaking quorum decreases as the session unfolds.
Yeah.
So if the sequencing works out in a way that the Democrats can bolt for a few days. Now remember, and I'm sure you've seen this, the other thing to remember here is that the House rules anticipated just this moment in that, or at least some approximation of it, in that the House rules now have a $500 a day fine on members for every day that they are not in attendance, and that doesn't come out of your can't come out of campaign funds, can't come out of your office budget, comes out of your pocket.
Right.
Now, panel yesterday, Harvey Kronberg was arguing that there are people willing to cover those costs. Yeah. And that's, probably right.
That, that carries its own advantages and disadvantages.
Right. So Soros paid you guys to leave.
Right. I mean, so who, Abbott's got $80 million and we're talking about the people paying $500 a day for,
right.
So,
I mean, I don't want to say that will, that in itself, I kind of respect what the point Harvey is making is that, there are probably people that are willing to help defray those costs, but, it's not nothing. So anyway, all of that is just a way of saying, I think, I think that may be one of the reasons that so many people think, look, this is not going to get resolved one way or the other in one session, because there's going to be a lot of, tactical sidestepping by the Democrats to, to try to avoid this redistricting with the support and the pressure from both national Democratic elites. They're up there meeting with Hakeem Jeffries and all this. And also this, this amorphous sense that, well, I think my voters want me to do this, whether they do or not. Or I think it's more likely my voters want me to do something, and this is the something that I think I should be doing to demonstrate them that I have that commitment. And I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
and you've got to get a lot of Democrats to do it. I mean,
yeah, and I mean this, in some ways, and this is all really central to the discussion that we're having about all this other stuff, which is that all depends on what not just what you think, but what turn out to be the actual priorities of the people who are making these decisions. Right. And that's not something we're going to know. And I think you're right, we kind of guys will come back to this, which is if Abbott really just needs flood mitigation and redistricting, and he can get them within 30 days, and I think, again, and a bunch of this other stuff falls by the wayside, I think he would be fine. And I actually think to some extent, I mean, something that I've been sort of tracking with or thinking about in terms of our polling and everything else is, Democrats in the most recent poll, there's sort of an interesting shift in opinion. I'm just going to flag it because I think it's useful. And, and we've talked about this many, many times, but, generally speaking, when we ask people what's the most important issue facing the state, about, 50 to 60% of Republicans, although it's been going down since Trump took office, will say immigration or the border. For Democrats, it takes about 6 or 7 issues to get to 60 to 70%. You're talking about education, healthcare, climate, gun control, the economy, political corruption, leadership. Well, all of a sudden in the last poll, about 30 to 40% of Democrats, both when asked about the most important problem facing the state and the country, pointed to political corruption in leadership. And I do wonder for Abbott, as he gets closer and closer to Trump, when we talked a lot about this, how Trump inserted himself during the legislative session very, very publicly, to the extent that Texas is seen, whether this is fair or not, to be doing the bidding of Trump, and Abbott seemed to be reacting to Trump aggressively in such a way that, again, is, speaks to the drawing of the lines and the way the game is being played sort of in the middle of the game, which, we're all adults here. It's fine. It's politics, right? But I think it does draw more attention to Abbott in a way that probably, I don't want to say it doesn't help him outside of his Republican primary electorate.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. And, he's beginning to appear, I don't think I'm ready to say risky yet.
Yeah.
But we're beginning to see some tremors in the Trump base over this Epstein thing. Personally, I think it's going to pass.
Yeah.
But I would have thought it passed already, and they're obviously worried about it.
Yeah, and I'd also just say one other thing. We're talking, I remember during the last sort of special session runs about property taxes and vouchers and all that last session. And, somebody at one point asked me, well, can't Abbott just keep calling them back and again and again? I go, well, yeah, he has the right to do that, but ultimately you just eventually look ineffective.
Yeah.
And so just to say, in a small government, say where they're not supposed to be here all the time, where they're supposed to get their work done, there is he can't just keep calling them back. Yeah. Again and again, because at some point he just looks like he can't accomplish what
and
he
also
says.
Remember, in this case, they also
there's a deadline.
I mean, it's not right next. It's the deadline isn't tomorrow, but because the fulcrum here, to the extent that the fulcrum here is redistricting, there's a time limit.
Yeah, there. December 8th is the filing deadline.
Yeah,
for
there
the
are
primary.
filing deadlines. There's going to be court challenges no matter what you do. So the sooner you can get this done, the better, I think.
Well, and just to hit on a couple of these things. I mean, there's been a lot of questions that we've sort of gotten about, well, how likely is it that they're? And I don't know. I mean, I like to assume there's a lot of sophisticated people who know what they're doing, who are working on this. So I don't think that these numbers are just made up. I'll say this, a couple things, just first as someone who watches this thing and then someone as a data person. As someone who watches this thing, it's notable in redistricting how careful everybody usually is. And when I say careful, I mean careful about what they say, careful about how they transfer information, what they put in emails. That is not the process that we're looking at right now.
Well, they're victims of Donald Trump's success at this.
Well, they are, but the state right now, I mean, literally.
I mean, specifically in terms of, the scenario I think you're referring to is, when the current maps are, being, some parts of the current maps are in court, the redistricting chair in the Senate, you could, give her truth serum and she'd still, I think, say, race wasn't even on my mind.
Right. And then the DOJ this week said, we think you built these districts based on race. Now, they mean a different thing. It's kind of like bail reform. Let's not get into it. But they said, hey, we think you used race. And they're like, well, maybe we did.
Yeah, I guess we better. You guys say so.
And the fact is, these public statements matter. The stuff that goes on during these things matter. And you may say, well, yeah, it's not really, but look, if this takes a little while and there's going to be a court challenge, which there is definitely going to be a court challenge, and then all of a sudden you've got these contradictory statements about the role that race played in the creation of these maps and the drawing of these districts. Well, I'm going to say that's probably going to be a problem. It's not guaranteed to be a problem. But it's probably going to create some kind of problem. So that's just one observation. The other is just to say, again, I assume everybody who's doing this is sophisticated. But I will point out that the data that's available, from my perspective, doesn't seem to be super, I don't want to say directive about this. And I'll just point out this way. And people point this out in the sense, that's not the right word. I'm trying to figure out what the right word is. I'm skeptical. And the reason I'm skeptical is one.
You're skeptical of what?
Of the ability to generate 3 to 5 seats with a map draw. It's easy. It would just easily happen. And part of it is that, you've got census data, which is now pretty old, right? And it seems like a lot of the rationale that's being thrown around that's not cover is, look, we're doing really well in the state, we being Republicans.
Yeah.
And so therefore, we've had gains in some certain parts of the state and these should be reflected in the map. those gains are basically based on 2024. And we talk all the time about how you can't draw a line through 2 points. It's really hard to draw a line through 1 point either, because you can put it in any direction you want. Midterm elections have lower turnout than general elections. Also, the president's party usually has a tougher time in midterm elections than they do in generals. Yeah. So whatever data that people have available to them, I just don't know how prescriptive it is about how you would make movements to generate the kind of certain outcomes that people are saying. And again, a lot of it's bravado. But the idea that like, whoa, we could definitely generate 3 to 5 seats, no problem. I'm kind of like, I'd like to see it. I don't know that's true.
And I guess, like I was trying to figure out because I don't disagree with that, but something about the way you set that up when you were talking about it before that I couldn't quite say, yeah, that's right, or I agree. Yeah. But I think part of what's going on to me is that there's 2 different things, right. Or there's at least 2 different things. One, can they take these heavily, for all intents and purposes, uncontested Republican states or seats. Republican Senate or House districts, U.S. House districts, and start moving things around, and build, we'll just call them what they're building, 4 or 5 Republican opportunity districts.
Yeah, right.
Right? And I think they can. Now, the problem is, what are the trade-offs? And this is what I've been saying kind of from the beginning when this came up is I think they can do that without too much problem.
Yeah.
But can they do that in a way that doesn't cause exposure elsewhere?
Yeah.
And put some other shit, which is why, virtually nobody nobody in the Republican delegation, in the Texas delegation is coming out publicly and going, no, we shouldn't do that. But everybody's talking off the record about it. And then, we get John Carter the other day saying, I'm fine. Draw me a district. I can win wherever.
Of all the Republicans, like, I don't think he should be saying that, but that's just
that's exactly. And yet there he is.
Right.
Right. So I guess what I think about that is, whether they're using some amalgam of 2024, 2022, whether they're, however smart or not smart or responsible or conscious they're being about the data they're using for the baseline, I think we do know enough about just how lopsided some of those districts are.
Yeah.
And that once they're saying we're going to create that many, they're going to try to create that many seats, and they're attacking those seats in Houston and, the districts in the DOJ letter to the state. I mean, the fact that it's some around Houston, some around Dallas, and then those South Texas districts that abut into Central Texas, you're moving everything around.
Yeah.
Right? And so that means that, do I think that once they do that, they're guaranteed 4 or 5 seats? I agree with you on that. There's, the data's not sound enough, and there's just, look, it's an election. It's inherently uncertain. We don't know how much 2026 is going to look like 2018.
Right.
Reasonable argument that it's going to look a lot that way, but, been a lot of reasonable arguments for things related to elections involving Donald Trump that we've kind of gone, except it didn't. And so, if the outcome is they get new maps that are drawn according to these lines and they rejigger everything and they piss everybody off and they maybe kind of take it, as an opportunity to screw somebody like, say, I don't know, off the top of my head, Chip Roy.
Right.
And they either hold or they knock off Cuellar or Vicente Gonzalez, and maybe they pick up another one of these seats that they diddle with and they get 2 or 3. Everybody, you could be right, but they're still going to be fine.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'd say, like, I still find myself, even the way that you lay that out, I think we're just sort of, there's a lot of unknowns here. We just have to acknowledge that there's just unknowns. I just, thinking about the way that they changed the seats and the way that they've changed them between the last round and this round, and sort of the rationale behind that, in the sense that, I think about Austin as a good.
By last round, you mean 2010 and 2020?
I'm talking about, the districts.
2011 and 2021.
Yeah, I'm talking about the districts that we had during the last decade and the one they've changed them to now, and sort of the nature of those changes. And one of the things is, Chip Roy used to represent basically the University of Texas, right? And way, way out west of here.
Yeah.
And
and he almost lost, and they helped him out.
Yeah, and there were about 6 representatives who represented the Austin area, all with sort of a finger in Austin and then all out into wherever. And then they sort of, and again, the election trends that sort of were ongoing were like, boy, that's kind of making a problem for some of these districts. So they decided, sort of against, what everybody said they were going to do for a long time. It was like, well, let's just make an Austin district. Let's just pack all those Democratic votes.
And do basically an incumbent protection plan,
right? But
that included Democrats.
Well, that's exactly right, and including. So that's the other thing too, which is, there's sort of two things going on here, which is, one, I would say, there's a couple of different things, but one, I'd say. It was an incumbent protection plan, which means those Democratic districts aren't 52-48 districts in most cases. They're also like 60-40 districts in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
So when you've got a 60-40 district next to a 60-40 district, yeah, you can move voters around, but also, this is part of political geography too. The voters who are the most movable, because they have to be adjacent to the district, are also probably the least politically homogenous. So in the sense of you're not going to get a bunch of conservatives.
In the urban districts.
In the urban districts, which are really what you're talking about in that area.
Yeah,
Now look, you can mess around in South Texas for sure. And those 3 seats, if you've got the one congressionally, if you want to go after Cuellar, if you want to go after Gonzalez, you can do it. And you're going to do it by grabbing more of those sort of rural voters who are up in between central Texas and the Valley. But then what that's going to mean is ultimately what? Well, you're piling more Democratic voters into those seats. And that's kind of where they were in 2018. Now, the thing is, this might benefit Trump in this 2-year cycle, but as people point out,
let's be clear, that's all he cares about.
That's all he cares about. But that's what's sort of interesting about this is that, this may net you some version of what you say it might net you. It may not, because the conditions may not support it.
Yeah.
And then also you may just be creating less safe seats for yourself going forward.
Well, look, I think they are. And I think because he doesn't have to bear the cost, I don't think Trump and the people around him care.
Yeah.
I think they think if they can just push through this next cycle.
Yeah.
What they're, you can almost see what the conversations were like. They bring the map jars to DC and they go, hey, why didn't, you should just make, Chip Roy can work harder or whoever, Chip Roy it's not a good example because they would say that first.
Yeah.
But, just make your guys work harder.
Do you know what I don't know? And
that's what I think.
We're kind of getting near the end of this, but I'll throw this out there. Maybe someone can email me, but I'm going to look into it because I would like to know. Ultimately, when you redistrict, you need to maintain some kind of equal representation of the district. You have similar numbers of voters. So I wonder at a mid-decade district, what data do they rely on to guarantee that? Because to your point, you can say why don't you just move these guys here? Why don't you just move these guys here? And it's and I think that's exactly what some people are kind of approach this with sophistication. I want to be clear. They've got models, they've got maps, they've got GIS, they're working this stuff, but also, what is the data? Because at the end of the day, you might kind of redo these districts. Are these all one person, one vote? You say, what kind of rate? Are you dismantling opportunity districts? What is happening here?
I think that bar is obviously so much lower now.
Right. But I just wonder what the data is.
I just don't have that. I've looked at those spreadsheets and I don't remember. I think because it's not voters, it's population, that they just use the most recent census data.
Well, that's going to be problematic because those are all estimates.
Yeah, but that's what they have.
Yeah, I guess.
But I think that's what they use.
Yeah.
And so and if that's what I see your skepticism, but if that's what they use, use what you have.
Well, no, I said I'm starting it with a question. I don't know what they use in this space. It just seems to me that because the courts are actually very specific about the level of deviation, there's specific deviation that you can have between the size of districts, and it depends on what the district
I understand
is.
all that,
No,
but I do think the baseline data
not for you.
is...
I know. No, I'm doing it for the audience. I know you know, but what I'm saying is, if it's already the case that there's a smaller baseline deviation at the congressional level than as you go down, so you already have an expectation of a small deviation between the size of those districts, and then you've got an estimate of the number of people in those districts, which also has a bunch of variance associated with it. And so I just wonder, going to this court thing, there's lots of different ways that this could be challenged, but one of them is just hey, do these districts even meet the basic standards of one person, one vote if you just start messing with people mid-decade in a way that's not a little change, but as you point out, probably messes with all the districts in some way or form. I don't know. I'm just, I'm sure someone's out there with some more information.
Yeah, I don't think once you've accepted what the data is, even if the data, as we well know, people use estimates all the time.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
who am I thinking? Oh, wait.
Oh, no. Uh-oh. Is it time to end?
Okay, on that. All right, good chat. Monday, all happens Monday. Legislature back in town. We will probably, I'm going to put a pin in. We probably will not have a podcast next week, but be back the week after, unless, something changes and I get a guest or something, because Josh will not be entirely available.
I'm allowed.
So with that, thanks for being here, Josh. As always, excellent technical support from the audio studio here in the Liberal Arts Development Studio at the University of Texas at Austin. Thanks to you for listening. As always, the data referenced in the podcast, not a ton today, but some. But all of our polling data, lots of other stuff available at the Texas Politics Project website, texaspolitics.utexas.edu. So be well, and we'll talk to you on the next Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.